Hi there, and if you are watching this video, then you must be wondering what on earth has happened to the world today. Perhaps, like myself, you feel like you've somehow woken up mid-dream in some alternate reality, like the sci-fi series The Twilight Zone. Let me give you the punchline up front. It is the result of a godless culture. It is the eternal battle of the mind played out before our very eyes, where selfishness, which is the root of all evil, through an idealist moral relativity and the active denial of reality, prioritizes the ego at any and all cost. However irrational, there is an activist agenda behind all this, and many bamboozled, well-intentioned individuals seem to buy into it. Now, if you want to hear more, please stick around for my detailed philosophical take on it. Many Christians ask, are we seeing the signs of the end times? You know, those prophesied like in Matthew, where Jesus said, "And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass. But the end is not yet, for nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. And these are the beginning of sorrows. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended, will betray one another, will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many, because lawlessness will abound. The love of many will grow cold, but he who endures to the end shall be saved." In Matthew. Now, I personally don't believe in an ultimate apocalypse, a destruction of the world as a whole. Why would an infinite God destroy his seeding ground for continuing creation? However, there is certainly a lot, and I mean a lot, of change happening. Religion, and fundamentally Christianity, is being attacked. So much so that the majority now says that it does more harm than good, which to me is crazy and factually incorrect. We've seen incredible political polarisation happening in the world, with Brexit, Wilders' Dutch Freedom Party, Le Pen's Nationalist Party in France, Norbert Hofer's Freedom Party in Austria, Donald Trump in the US, all attracting a lot of attention, much of it being negative and intolerant of difference. We have seen a lot of Islamist terrorism worldwide, and the intolerance that is so tangible globally is now also visible in Australia in the current political debate on same-sex marriage. It has been brewing for a while, I must add. Now let me dive in here and say that it occurs to me that this whole same-sex or gender-indifferent marriage debate has actually very little to do with homosexuality. The group or number of same-sex couples is actually a very, very small percentage of the overall population, 0.4% according to 2016 census. And to think that they're all rooting for what is happening at the moment is absurd. There is actually a political process behind this, an ideology, and it is very much on the political left, and I'll explain in a second why. To think that all same-sex attracted people are on board and think alike is of course not true. There is nothing to think that people who are same-sex attracted think fundamentally different than the general population, and very much greater on a political spectrum. Therefore you will expect a range of them, possibly even about 50%, to be more conservative in their approach, and so there are many same-sex attracted conservatives against same-sex marriage, and who are very much, in favour of capitalism, personal liberty, religious freedom, and the things that I also believe in. Now, I'm not a person that's really across all the various different ideological labels and identity groups in depth, so I use different words and look to express the behaviour or ideas rather than the philosophical or political definitions. So forgive me if what I say comes across as overly simplistic, or because I don't go into the technical details. I assume if this interests you, you'll be able to investigate this further for yourself, and if you do, you'll be able to confirm that what I say is true. You may have recently heard people talk about cultural Marxism, socialism, and perhaps about postmodernism. Now, I've heard these mentioned, but have never had an active interest in it. Marxism somewhat, and socialism because I also have a keen interest in politics, but I always associated postmodernism with art. Now, art is my wife's areas of expertise into which I dare not venture or claim to have any knowledge. Well, it seems in the minds of many today's society that these philosophies are coming together, even if it's not by conscious effort. I was watching an ideation talk given by Jordan Peterson, and when he pointed it out, it just kind of clicked for me that these ideas are in fact sitting behind the same-sex marriage debates, as well as the new stream of feminist, gender fluidity theories, trigger warnings, safe spaces, but also climate change, the violent Antifa movement, the removal of historical monuments and the like. You know, those emotion-based ideas about perceived inequality of any kind. Now, if this is all new to you, please bear with me until the end, as I think it would be worthwhile going through this to understand the ideological thought processes that we currently experience and its underpinning cause. Why many seem hell-bent on undermining our Western Judeo-Christian and democratic cultural values. You know, free market capitalism, the rule of common law, religious freedom, individual rights of ownership, freedom of speech and representative elected government. You know, there is a growing mass of idealists actually looking to self-destruct their own cultures founded on liberty and democracy. You know, those cultures where people are free to pursue their dreams, but are also personally responsible. This growing group has a serious streak of collectivist anarchy to them, and they are incredibly intolerant, and this intolerance is certainly quite visibly promoted and accepted. Now, before I go into my take on what's wrong with all this, and the cause philosophically and spiritually as I understand it, I need to briefly explain the philosophical terms that I've mentioned before. Let us first have a look at the postmodernist. Postmodernism questions the certainty or even denies scientific or objective efforts to explain reality. It invariably asserts that claims to knowledge and truth are effectively socially constructed. In other words, it holds that we make them up as we go along. Now, this relative look at truth is also referred to as pluralism, which is the idea that there is no single objective truth. Postmodern thought is therefore characterized by some moral relativism. Because there is no objective moral standard, then morality is simply what we believe it to be. There is irreverence towards science, philosophy and religion. There is a self-referentiality, in other words, how everything relates to me, serves me or defines me. And cultural relativism, i.e. all cultures are of equal value and no culture is better than another. So, philosophically, it believes that there is an infinite number of ways reality can be interpreted. And I agree somewhat, as you've got 7 billion people in the world and at the moment, and therefore 7 billion different minds, of which no two are alike. To me, that makes perfect sense. But that doesn't mean that we should reject reality, which is pretty much what postmodern thinking does and where it goes off the rails. It replaces objective reality, truth, with our individual perception or interpretation of it, effectively putting one's own experience of reality in place of reality itself. Now, those who subscribe to postmodernist thought, therefore, also believe that philosophical ideas and values held by people are all equal. Now, if you will, that everybody's equal, everybody's the same from a cultural or moral perspective, which comes as a result of denying objective reality, objective truth, and thus objective morality. This, in my opinion, is again where it goes wrong. While people should be looked at as equally valued and worthy as individuals, certainly not all beliefs, ideas and values are equal. Not all interpretations of life and moral standards can hold equally true. That's simply unreasonable and nonsensical. For example, if you compare autocratic or oligarchical cultures such as most Islamic and socialist nations with Western Judeo-Christian democratic world, then you can clearly see incompatibilities and differences in their values. Differences that come to bear in the lives of the individuals within it. To deny objective reality is to deny the effect it has on us and others. However, What many on the left political spectrum concurrently, while holding the before mentioned beliefs, claim is that some are affected disproportionately and there is an inequality which is simply nonsensical. Either we make up our own perceptions and there is no objective reality outside of my interpretations, or there is an objective reality. You cannot claim to have both. Now, let us have a look at cultural Marxist ideas, or more technically accurate called the Frankfurt School of Thought. It is closely related with socialism, which most people will have heard of. Socialism is the ideology that seeks for the means of production to be owned by all collectively. It's also referred to or synonymous with communism. Frankfurt School looked at social and philosophy, concluding that empirical evidence used to study and interpret social phenomena was insufficient, and it held to idealist philosophy. It also rejected capitalism, materialism and deterministic ideas, instead holding to idealism, which asserts that reality, or reality as we can know it, is fundamentally mental, mentally constructed or otherwise immaterial. It is basically a cobbling together of ideas from Immanuel Kant, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, Maximilian Weber and others. This idealist view makes it vehemently anti-scientific, something which we notice with the postmodernist views too. And while I agree with reality being mentally constructed and thus personally have some idealist or solipsistic elements to my understanding of reality, I do not subscribe to solipsism or agree that we simply make reality up as we go individually. My grounding is supported by scientific knowledge uncovered with quantum physics, whereas idealism, especially coupled with postmodernism, is really a rejection of scientific knowledge, or to put it another way, objective truth. Cultural Marxism, therefore, too, is very much affirmative of individual feelings and perceptions of reality over external absolutes, thus giving ultimate validity to our perceptions and not objective reality. And in case you are wondering, I have a video on my channel explaining in depth my view of how reality is created, and please check it out. So, being fundamentally socialist, as you heard and would expect, Marxism is also vehemently anti-capitalist. Based on a class system of thought, it sees the workers as oppressed, the proletariat, versus the employers as oppressors, the bourgeoisie. Within current culture, where there is no such clear distinction, the workers have been replaced with minority groups and the employers with dominant groups in society. This is also partly informed by their moral and cultural relativity. So they would see any more dominantly held morality or culture as being oppressive. However, this class warfare, because of its religious philosophical acceptance, extends to all areas of life in spite of these idealist views. People seek to control others and limit others' views. Now, why do this if perception is reality? Why not simply change your own perceptions? Marxism, being socialist, i.e. on the left side of politics, seeks to provide an equal outcome for all, regardless of effort or input. It is therefore a political ideology which is effectively forcing everybody into equality. Although equality is the wrong word in my opinion. Equity is more appropriate, because we are talking about enforcing outcomes, which in fact requires people to be treated unequally. More generally though, the collective elements that I have mentioned under both postmodernism and the Frankfurt School of Thought are referred to in broad terms as cultural Marxism. So now you're up with cultural Marxism, and you can go and explain it to others. So cultural Marxism is the collective ideology that is, as you've heard, vehemently anti-capitalist, anti-individualist, anti-theist, anti-democratic and anti-liberal. And I'll explain a bit more in detail later on. Now, both these ideas or worldviews are now coming together. Now, what's wrong with it? Well, I've already highlighted the anti-scientific or relative approach to truth and the reference of the self over others. But let's have a look at equality. In reality, everybody has a different starting point. We all have a different IQ, a different gender, a different physique, different family, a different country, different language, different culture, different natural environment, religion, etc. And from a Marxist or socialist perspective, that's unfair. It's unreasonable to accept these differences, and those differences need to be addressed because there is an injustice. If there is a difference and someone somehow is to start at an advantage over another, then it is unjust and needs to be addressed and corrected. It's antithetical to a capitalist reward for effort system where people proportionately benefit from their disproportionate efforts. Therefore, that position is vehemently anti-capitalist and anti-liberal, classical kind, because it needs to be enforced by gunpoint and at the threat of prison. Nobody is going to give up their freedoms voluntarily, their opportunities and their personal advantages by themselves. Parents work very hard to give their children an advantage in life. And if someone somehow goes to university, becomes a doctor and takes a risk and has their investment pay off, or they've generated some advantage for themselves through opportunity, they are not likely to offer it up and to give it indiscriminately to those who decided not to put the effort in. Would you? The Marxists would choose to force everybody to enjoy the outcomes equally, even if one starts different. It is collectivist, meaning that the means of production and thus the outcomes are equally owned regardless of input. And it is therefore against the free market outcomes and against private ownership and corporate profits. Should I just give up the opportunities that presents, that I work so hard for? Give half of my income to some person window washing on the street because they've had a drug addiction and fell into a gap? No. Please don't get me wrong, I'm not some cold-hearted bastard that doesn't care about the weak and the vulnerable. But surely people must take some personal responsibility. Well, not according to cultural Marxists, it seems. Some people have disadvantages, whether by their own making or circumstantial. But why should anyone give up half or more of their income to such persons? Doing that forces everyone into the lowest common denominator. A reduction in reward leads to a reduction in effort. And what you penalise is what you get less of, production. And what you subsidise, you get more of, bludgeoning. This was experienced in Russia, Cuba, Romania, etc. And today we see it in Venezuela, where the common or non-government people have no food, yet the country has the largest oil reserves known in the world. Now, before I move on, I'd like to briefly share a quote from Scripture too. But we command you, brethren, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you withdraw from every brother who walks disorderly, and not according to the tradition which he received from us. For you yourselves know how you ought to follow us. For we were not disorderly among you, nor did we eat anyone's bread free of charge, but worked with labour and toil night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you. Not because we do not have authority, but to make ourselves an example of how you should follow us. For even when we were with you, we commanded you this, that if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. For we hear that there are some of you who walk among you in a disorderly manner, not working at all. These are busybodies. Now, who are such we command and exhort through our Lord Jesus Christ, that they work in quietness and eat their own bread. We see that in Thessalonians. You shouldn't expect all the same things, especially when clearly there isn't that balanced input and effort. How is that fair or reasonable? Why would you reward laziness? We need to take some responsibility for our own actions and resulting outcomes. Of course, it's absurd to try to get equal outcomes, but yet that's what goes on in the left side of politics, with socialist ideology that is so visible today. So far, we have seen that the cultural Marxism, so pervasive in a mindset on the left of the political spectrum, is so vehemently anti-liberal, anti-scientific, anti-capitalist, self-affirming or self-centered, collectivist, and therefore authoritarian and statist. Because of its idealistic views and subsequent cultural and moral relativity, it is also anti-Christian, anti-Semitic. Now let us move on, because I want to highlight that any current issue isn't actually the issue. I cannot stress that enough. because of the infinite number of interpretations of reality. There truly is never an end to changes in perceptions of inequality and injustice to fight and correct. The core is the same from issue to issue. There is always a new injustice to tackle or inequality to address. I'm starting to think that it is rather more about virtue signaling and being perceived to do good than to actually wanting to acknowledge what is truly good, which of course would require an objective morality and an objective truth. Until now we've had a global warming as a kind of show pony, a focus point or hobby horse if you will. Maybe more of a Trojan horse, seeing as what we now know. But because there are other far more important issues to focus on as society. The left is trying to force its cultural Marxist personified religion of self-actuality and moral relativity onto a new platform of social experimentation, and this time its host or catch cry is marriage equality, more appropriately termed genderless marriage, especially in Australia where there currently is a public vote being polled by the government. But in almost every country, and I don't know of any exceptions where genderless marriage has been introduced, a lot of freedoms have been eroded, particularly religious freedoms. And this is because people do not freely comply. They are autonomous thinkers. Well, I hope most of us are. To ensure cultural compliance, churches have been forced to marry people. New pronoun language is being demanded by governments and gender fluidity is being taught and promoted in schools. At a quick glance, this seems a little counter to the trend, this diversification of language and gender. But for one, it again stems from affirming feelings as reality. However, it also forms part of the equalization of all individuals, which are referred to as homogenization. This is also observable with the new wave of feminism, which seeks to deny any distinction between men and women. To accommodate the individual perceptions, they have now theorized that gender and sex are different, that gender can now be anything that you like. Now, this is homogenization of gender through infinite distinction, which ultimately becomes indistinction. This is like breaking it apart in infinite pieces so that ultimately you can't distinguish anything anymore. And I've spoken about that in the past as well. So all of this is part of that cultural Marxist approach, and it doesn't like any particular group to be advantaged, or it doesn't see any group or any idea better than another. That is the political movement behind this, which is why you predominantly see the left politicians accepting this so keenly. So we have looked at it so far from a political perspective, and hopefully it has given you a clear sense of ideology and some of the labels that you may hear. I will dive a little deeper shortly and explain the core of the problem so that we can offer a solution. It has taken me a while thinking through all of this, but I think it ultimately helps focus our efforts and clarifies, especially where we as Swedenborgians can meaningfully help. So, you see, the current same-sex marriage debate has really nothing to do with Christianity versus homosexuals. In the same way, the new wave of extreme feminism, minority quotas, or the general political correctness that pervades society have nothing to do with being unjust, unfair, being discriminatory, or somehow actually highlighting real oppression. All of this is nonsensical because homosexuals have been accepted in society. Women are treated as equals, and having offence laws based on people's feelings is simply madness. Offence is taken. It's a personal perception and outside the control of the so-called offender, in their terms oppressor. These issues have been hijacked or created by this extreme political movement using language that is holding emotive power to effectively beat people into submission. Then you have a whole range of people that have been taken for a ride with this group. The so-called useful idiots with good intent have been bamboozled into thinking that they're doing a good thing. Now, in spite of the language, the vocal extremists actually hate people that disagree. They hate those who are for liberty, for personal freedom. It is truly sad to see all the elements that make our culture so great being destroyed by a group of absolute irrational lunatics. I have no other words for it. I say irrational because it comes from an extreme irrational and self-centered position which rejects objective reality. Now, these ideas have been around for a while, but it has now come out mainstream. Under the Lord's providence, it has come to the surface so that we can observe and deal with it. This is the eternal battle of our mind played out before our very eyes. I think that I'm correct in saying this, that is what the problem is. You know, while we discuss political and philosophical ideology and identity labels of behavioral traits, they have real spiritual significance for us underneath it all. So it is no longer to do effectively with same-sex attraction. That's just a symptom, a platform, a Trojan horse within which far more sinister elements are hidden. It is intolerance masquerading as tolerance, slavery masquerading as liberation, and selfishness masquerading as charity. I believe there is more to come, and as it plays out, and especially for us Christians, it will be a challenging time until we strip the externals and are able to display the value. We must ourselves stop seeking to control what is different from ourselves and to promote tolerance. We must be on our guard for the language that is incredibly effective and emotive, so we must promote rationality and objective truth. Why would anyone choose to accept these beliefs? Well, for the same reason that any and all of us could. It is easier to point a finger outside of us and to judge what is not us than it is to take personal responsibility and look within ourselves. We are being taken for a ride, and we need to be careful that we recognize our emotions being played and stand up for truth. We really need to move away from this nihilistic approach together to protect all the values that we share, both publicly and personally. This battle starts within. This public culture war is the same war our proprium or ego wages against all that is good and true, the divine. Our sense of autonomy, thinking that it is reality itself, that it exists autonomously. Now let us seek to clarify and unpack the root cause and how we can progress. The key to this lies in the prioritization of personal feelings and thoughts, in accepting this idealist or self-referencing view of the world. Inherent in this is the idea that our thoughts and feelings are us, that we have no control over it, because that would mean that we may need to be self-critical and that there is an external reality which is also rejected. If one feels we have no control over our thoughts and feelings, then disagreement is hate or aggression and a rejection of the person itself. Because their validity as a human being is tied up in that, then competing ideas and speech is therefore seen as violence and aggression, and so no different from physical violence. You see the problem? This is why headbutting a former Prime Minister is seen by many as okay, why asking someone out is now called sexual assault, and why religion is called evil. This thinking, coupled with extreme self-love, or perhaps being accepted because of it, is the root cause, and it comes as a rejection of objective reality and God, and so a rejection of absolute morality. Let me say it another way. Selfishness and the love of domination is the root of all evil, which when left unchecked results in a godless society, causing a lack of morality and order. And this is what we see today. Now let me share a couple of quotes from Swedenborg from his book Divine Providence. Rationality enables us to think on a higher level, and freedom enables us to think that way from desire intentionally. If we did not have the freedom to think that way, that is, we would not have the intention and therefore could not have the thought. The result is that if we do not want to understand anything except what has to do with this world and its nature, if we do not want to understand what is good and true on moral and spiritual levels, we cannot rise from knowledge into intelligence, let alone from intelligence into wisdom, because we have blocked off these abilities. And the second one, I have mentioned that real freedom and real rationality are impossible for people who deny the Lord's divine nature and the holiness of the Word, and for people who opt decisively for the material world and against divinity, and also that they are difficult for people who have to a large extent convince themselves of false religious principles. Now out of this I take two key points. One is that God provides us with rationality and freedom, and 2, that what you choose to believe matters. Without God, there is no rationality. So without God, we are not in control of our own mind. And I've spoken about this before too. Swedenborg is not the only one to highlight human rationality and highlight 2 distinct levels of thought. About 100 years after Swedenborg, Carl Jung says the same thing, that what makes us human is exactly that we can contemplate our thoughts and think about our thoughts and feelings, deciding which to accept and which to reject. It seems to me this victimhood mentality, identifying our thoughts and feelings as being the person over which we have no control, is actually dehumanizing, removing our God-given humanity, rationality and freedom. Now let me try to summarize the logic or thought processes that drives this cultural Marxist victimhood mentality without the isms and the other labels. 1. Identification with personal thoughts and feelings. I therefore have no control over the thoughts and feelings, and therefore no control over the behavior as a result. Then therefore an attack on ideas is an attack on a person, and a value judgment of ideas a value judgment of people. Now this leads to a victimhood mentality, as people cannot control their feeling and their emotions, so they are always a victim of circumstance. This means that those that are better off must have either been abusing others or have had an unfair advantage somehow. And this also coincides with the philosophical approach that only one's perceived reality is valid, and oddly enough the same counts for the infinite interpretation of others. This leads to cultural relativism, that no culture is better than another because no person, their views of reality, can be better than another. This then drives an anti-authoritarianism against any system that proposes a higher value or morality, being classical liberalism, valuing individualism and free speech and the freedom to disagree, or capitalism, the free market economics with a reward for effort, and religion, having a moral certainty or an objective reality. Now of course this egalitarianism or approach for equity must be enforced. It's a moral obligation. And funny enough, enforcing behavior as moral while ascribing to relative morality is a bit hypocritical. But there's also in fact an extreme left political ideology, think Marxist, communist and socialist, all very much synonymous, which seeks to ensure homogenization of outcomes. This is why these philosophical ideals correlate with the political left spectrum, and politics is about governing or control of people and legislature. You can see then that this stands then opposed to the capitalist and libertarian ideal on the right, which seeks to treat all people the same and to seek equality of opportunity. You can see therefore that this order is fighting a true culture war, which is nihilistic towards traditional Western values. Same-sex marriage is just a Trojan horse to hide behind, just like climate scare was before and overt communism before that. And this is also what sits behind a new wave of extreme feminism, the gender fluidity theory, the intellectual safe spaces, trigger warnings for hearing opposing ideas, the political correct ideology that pervades our society, and the full frontal attack on free speech, which is directed only to traditional liberal values, conservatism and Judeo-Christian religion. Of course, we all still have the right to our own opinions, but not our own reality. Whether you want to or not, we all must accept that there is an ultimate independent reality which shapes our boundaries and provides a framework within which we all exist. Furthermore, for good to exist, there must be an independent moral standard which holds, a purpose, because without a purpose there can be no good. I'm sure that it must help is to know that we are not our thoughts and feelings, that God has given us rationality and freedom, and that there is an objective reality to which we must adhere and comply with, and that we are ultimately responsible for ourselves and our own outcomes, even if we don't all have the same opportunities, because life is not meant to be materialistically fair. Ultimately, it is about perception and relativity versus objective reality in this culture war. A self-referencing, egocentric view of the world versus a selfless care for others and an objective morality. an intolerance for difference versus heterogeneity and tolerance for others, or evil versus good. The godless left, like a child, has been spoiled and sheltered from reality, allowed to run free without consequences, and it is time for everyone to be accountable. Now finally, let me add this too. We all have the capacity to be selfish. Our own ego, if it were left to rule, would behave exactly the same. The external world in which we find ourselves is a mirror that is held up for us so that we are able to recognize the inner workings of our mind, our minds. While we are called to and must engage with others in the external material world and act within the natural, ultimately any change that we can control and where it must start is within our inner world. Only when we change our characters and engage in fearless introspection can we make a positive change to the external world. We are called to control ourselves, each of us individually, not control others. And it is this freedom that we must protect and promote. Now, I'd like to thank you very much for watching this, and I hope you find it useful and helpful, and that it helps you on your own personal spiritual path. And I'll see you next time. Thank you.